The hearing of the Senate Budget Committee will come to order. This is our first in our actual room and the second in a series of hearings looking at the effect of climate change on the federal budget. Senator Grassley cannot be here because the Attorney General is in the Judiciary Committee, and I will be spending some time there as well with the Attorney General, and Senator Kaine will take the gavel from me when that takes place. And I want to thank Senator Johnson for being here to step in for Ranking Member Grassley. After our first hearing's high-level budget impact overview, today we begin looking at the specific ways climate change will burden, and indeed is already burdening, our economy and our federal budget. We'll start with a look at our coasts, important to Rhode Island. The U.S. has nearly 13,000 miles of coastline. 40% of our population lives along that coast. More than $1 trillion worth of residential and commercial real estate is coastal, as is much of our infrastructure: ports, coastal roads, water treatment facilities. Climate change threatens to upend life as it's now lived in coastal communities and put immense burdens on government. Rhode Island may be the smallest physical state in the nation, but we have nearly 400 miles of coastline. In Warren, the smallest town and the smallest of our 5 counties, some homes have seen property values drop by 1/3 because of flood risk. Sea level rise is projected to permanently flood coastal portions of Warren over the next decade. In 2017, Zillow's real estate database identified over 4,800 homes in Rhode Island that would be underwater with a projected 6 feet of sea level rise, which is projected for us. That's nearly $3 billion in Rhode Island home values. Our coastal communities turn into a Rhode Island archipelago. The situation is not unique to Warren or Rhode Island. For most American households, their greatest wealth is their home. As homes and businesses in coastal communities face more frequent sunny day flooding and wetter and more violent ocean storms, insurance will become more expensive and harder to find. Mortgages depend on insurance, so lending will suffer. Coastal communities will become harder places to live and work, and real estate values and local tax bases will decline. Moody's is already looking at local municipal bonds in this light. In emergencies, coastal communities will turn to the federal government for financial assistance, and federal flood insurance costs will rise. The consequences extend beyond real estate. Much of our infrastructure, roads and bridges and military bases and ports, sits along coasts. When critical infrastructure is lost to regular inundation or to storm damage, local economies can suffer, and again, the federal government has to foot the bill. Unfortunately, the cost of these climate hazards is projected to grow. First Street Foundation has a peer-reviewed flood risk tool that shows significantly increasing risks to residential properties over the next 30 years. Rhode Island's own flood projections show similar risks. A study published just 2 weeks ago estimates flood risk in real estate markets, showing them overvalued now by $237 billion. Spoiler alert, the worst property overvaluations are along our coasts. The study warns that coastal real estate values may plummet and cascade into systemic risks for the mortgage market. I'll interrupt my remarks here for one moment to point out that this phrase, systemic risks, you'll hear a lot of in these hearings. It was defined in the last one. It means when a risk is so serious in one sector of the economy that it cascades across the rest of the economy, as we saw in the 2008 mortgage meltdown, which hurt a lot more people than those with bad mortgages. Freddie Mac has made similar warnings, so let me close by quoting their former chief economist here today on the damage that climate change is likely to inflict as coastal property values get hit. He said, "The economic losses and social disruption are likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and Great Recession." A sobering warning for those of us who lived through that. The only good news here is that by acting now, we can minimize the damage and costs to households, businesses, and our economy. I'll turn to Senator Johnson for his opening remarks, and then I'll introduce the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it is true I was asked to stand in as ranking member here, replaced Senator Grassley on Monday. So I need to first state that the opinions I express are those of my own, not Senator Grassley. I don't want to get him in trouble. Also want to say I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not a climate change alarmist. But I find the debate fascinating. I look forward to the hearing. Read a fair amount about it, a couple good books, Climate Change, The Facts, edited by Alan Moran. Apocalypse Never is a more recent one by subtitle there, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All by Michael Schellenberger. And then anything that Bjorn Lomborg writes. And by the way, I think I'm stating this right, that Mr. Lomborg completely acknowledges man-made climate change, just doesn't think we should spend anything with limited resources. There's far better ways of spending money to alleviate human suffering, and I'm glad to see that Mr. Lewis is citing Mr. Lomborg in his testimony a number of times. But in my mind, a good scientist is a very healthy skeptic, always questioning, always seeking the truth. And to me, the term scientific consensus, I know there certainly is some, but it's a very unscientific terms in many ways. Particularly when we're dealing with something that, I think there's a lot of legitimate disagreement in terms of climate change. But why am I skeptical? I'm 67 years old. I've lived through decades of Malthusianism, doomsayers. And I just asked my staff to get just a couple of the most delicious predictions. Not only were these individuals wrong, they were spectacularly wrong. In 1970, Harvard biologist George Wald estimated that, quote, civilization will end within 15 or 30 years by 1985 to 2000 unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. January 1970, Life magazine said scientists had solid evidence to support the prediction that by 1980, urban dwellers would have to wear gas masks to survive air pollution. In the spring of 1970, issue of The Living Wilderness, Dennis Hayes, the chief organizer for Earth Day, declared that, quote, it is already too late to avoid mass starvation. 1978, the New York Times reported that a team of climate specialists saw, quote, no end in sight to a 30-year cooling trend in the Northern Hemisphere. 1980, ecologist Kenneth Watt predicted the world would be 4 degrees colder in 1990 and 11 degrees colder in the year 2000. That, by the way, didn't happen. 1988, Maldives Director of Environmental Affairs predicted the rising sea levels threatened to cover the islands in the next 30 years. 1989, Noel Brown, a UN environmental official, said entire nations would be wiped off the earth if sea levels from global warming were not reversed by the year 2000. 2004, a Pentagon climate change report said Britain will be Siberia by the year 2020. Don't think that happened. 2007, head of the UN climate panel claimed that it would be, quote, too late unless drastic action were taken by the year 2012. And in 2008, Al Gore, by the way, anybody know how much his wealth has grown off of climate alarmism? But he cited a claim from another climate researcher that the North Pole may be ice-free by the year 2013. That didn't happen either. So you combine those spectacularly wrong predictions, time and time again, they're never held to account. Nobody ever fact-checks them. But you also just take a look at some data, some scientific data, like the Vostok ice core sample. More than 400,000 years of geologic history, 22.7 degree variation in 4 to 5 cycles. The Greenland ice core sample, 6.7 degrees variation. This is one I was spring in crowds. You know how much the sea level has risen in the Bay of San Francisco since the last glaciation period? 390 feet. So again, real or not, man-made climate change, I don't see how mankind can make even a negligible impact on changing the climate, which always changes. It always does. So I'm concerned that the cure is worse than disease, that we will be wasting limited resources, mortgaging our kids' future, particularly when China and India are not exactly on board and they're going to continue to provide power to pull their populations out of poverty. What this committee should be focusing on is $31.5 trillion worth of debt, a baseline budget that's gone from about $4.5 trillion prior to COVID to appears about $6 trillion, and nobody's even blinking an eye that we've increased that by a step function about $1.5 trillion. The fact that our interest rates are rising, and with every 1% increase in interest rates, our interest expense will rise by $315 billion. If we just return to the interest rate we paid in the last 3 decades of the last century, that would add $1.2 trillion in interest expense to our annual budget. That's about what we spend on Social Security. So, Mr. Chairman, again, I look forward to the hearing. I think it'll be interesting. I got a lot of questions, but I really think the Budget Committee ought to be focusing on the budget and focusing on that calamity that is roaring toward us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Johnson, and I think we are focusing on the budget by focusing on the sea level rise calamity that is roaring towards us. I'm pleased to have 5 witnesses here, including one from my home state. First is Matthew Eby, the founder and CEO of the First Street Foundation, which is a research and technology nonprofit that is defining America's climate risk. First Street began its work by looking at flood risk and just this week published a report on the rising cost of hurricane winds. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Sean Becchetti, a principal with Elliott Bay Analytics, which provides mortgage analytics consulting and advisory services. In his previous role as the chief economist at Freddie Mac, Dr. Becchetti wrote an article foretelling the many challenges facing coastal real estate. Following Dr. Becchetti, Kate Michaud will testify. Kate is the town manager for Warren, Rhode Island, where they are regularly dealing with the practical and immediate challenges of rising sea levels and flooding. After Ms. Michaud, we will be joined remotely by Dr. Jessica Weinkel, an associate professor from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, who teaches coastal and ocean policy and environmental politics and policy. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Marlo Lewis, Jr., who serves as a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, an organization founded to reform America's so-called unaccountable regulatory state. Mr. Eby, you have 5 minutes to begin your remarks. Please proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the Senate Committee on the Budget. My name is Matthew Eby, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer and founder of the First Street Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit headquartered in Brooklyn, New York, that is dedicated to make climate risk information accessible, easy to understand, actionable for citizens, businesses, and governments. I thank you for your invitation and the opportunity to speak and describe how the First Street Foundation is quantifying and communicating climate risk for the United States, and to relate our findings to the committee. Today, I will describe the highlights of the First Street Foundation models related to climate risk as a combination of the estimated exposure of each property and the vulnerability of buildings on those properties in dollars and cents. We have employed models of flood, wildfire, hurricane winds, and extreme heat to create probabilistic estimates of exposure for each of the approximately 143 million properties in the U.S. My oral testimony will focus primarily on our flood work. At the national level, the First Street Foundation flood model identifies 14.6 million properties as having a 1% annual risk of flooding, the same definition as the FEMA 1 in 100 special flood hazard area. While the definitions are the same, our findings are not. Our model identifies 5.9 million more properties across the country that have this risk and are outside of the FEMA special flood hazard area. Of these properties, 4.3 million are single-family 1 to 4 unit homes that are not built to a standard to prevent flood damage. These single-family properties face an estimated annual loss of $4,694 per property for a total of $20 billion in annualized damage today. These damage estimates are expected to grow by 61% over the next 30 years to an estimated annual loss of $7,563 per residential property, totaling $32.3 billion nationally. Commercial properties are at risk of an additional $14 billion in property damage today, growing to $17 billion over the next 30 years, and account for a huge amount of indirect community economic risk through the disruption of supply chains, lost labor, and lost productivity. These indirect costs associated with commercial building flood risk are around $50 billion today, growing to $63 billion in 30 years. Along with that, the First Street Foundation wind model finds around $18.5 billion in annualized property damage today, growing to around $20 billion in 30 years, which we have yet to calculate the downstream economic impacts of. Across the country, we have found 14% of residential properties, 17% of all social infrastructure, schools, places of worship, libraries, etc., 20% of commercial properties, 23% of all roads, and 25% of all critical infrastructure facilities, utilities, hospitals, police stations, that are all at risk of flooding and becoming impassable or non-operational. All of these categories will face increased substantially flood risk over the next 30 years, adding an additional 3 to 9% in exposure. The increasing exposure to the U.S. to flood perils has an observable impact on property value. By looking at the universe of available real estate transactions from the years 2005 to 2017 in coastal counties, we found a quantifiable $15.9 billion in losses directly attributable to properties exposed to mere tidal flooding. The overvaluation of these properties is further exacerbated by the economic damage associated with unknown flood risk and ultimately amounts to approximately $200 billion in current real estate market overvaluation. This overvaluation, if this overvaluation is ever realized, the impact would be dramatic. In closing, the First Street Foundation is grateful to the Senate Budget Committee for the opportunity to present our findings related to climate risks and their economic impacts on the nation, including our coastal communities. By creating property-specific, climate-adjusted estimates of physical climate risk exposure and related economic losses across the entire United States, First Street Foundation hopes to inspire informed action by citizens, businesses, and governments. We are proud to make our results publicly and freely available to individual Americans and to democratize access to key risk information that will support informed decision-making and can result in communities that are more resilient in the face of climate change. We remain optimistic by the continuing to be informed by the science that we, as a nation, can find ways to address climate change and create more resilient communities today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eby, and thank you for the support and guidance that you provide to coastal communities who have access to your work. Let me turn now to Dr. Becchetti.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to address the ways sea level rise and increasing flood risk affect housing. In 2016, while I was the chief economist at Freddie Mac, I co-wrote an article about the potential impact of flood risk on housing with a special focus on sea level rise. The article was called Life's a Beach. I believe that article is more relevant today than when it was published, and I would like to summarize the key points for you. Sea level has risen measurably over more than a century. Between 1901 and 2018, the globally average sea level rose by between 6 and 10 inches, and more precise satellite radar data for the period 1993 to 2017 indicates that the pace of sea level rise is accelerating. The rate of sea level rise varies considerably across regions. For instance, the sea level along the eastern seaboard of the United States has been rising 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. And in the Miami area alone, daily high water levels have been rising almost an inch a year. Floods also have become more common, and some cities on the East Coast have experienced a tenfold increase in the frequency of flooding. In the years since the publication of Life's a Beach, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recorded 12 floods that each caused more than $1 billion in damage. The primary source of flood insurance in the United States is the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. By subsidizing the premiums on the insurance it offers, NFIP actually encourages development in the floodplain. Moreover, many of the NFIP flood maps are out of date. Independent research suggests that many areas tagged as outside the floodplain by NFIP in fact face a significant risk of flood. Finally, NFIP is expensive. In 2017, Congress forgave $16 billion in order to keep NFIP within its $30.5 billion debt limit. And currently, NFIP accrues over $1 million per day in interest charges on its approximately $20 billion in debt. The increases in sea level and flood risk pose challenges both for homeowners and for the housing system generally. Let me list just 5 of these challenges. 1, most mortgages in the United States are 30-year loans. In areas where sea level rise may make homes uninhabitable in 30 years or less, lenders may become reluctant to offer 30-year mortgages. Second, private insurance contracts are annual. As flood risks increase, Insurance companies may choose between steadily rising premiums or simply failing to renew policies when these risks become near certainties. Third, taxpayers may balk at covering the escalating costs of the NFIP in light of the predictability of the losses. Taxpayers may feel that the affected homeowners ignored decades-long warnings of the risks they were bearing. 4, a large share of homeowners' wealth is locked up in the equity in their homes. If those homes become uninsurable and unmarketable, the values of the homes will plummet. And unlike the experience of 2007 and 2008, these homeowners will have no expectation that the values of their homes will ever recover. Finally, floods damage the infrastructure in a community. As a result, even homeowners on high ground who avoid direct damage may suffer losses as community services deteriorate and businesses are forced to relocate, taking employment opportunities with them. These are just a few of the challenges posed by sea level rise and flood risk, and there are no simple solutions. Nonetheless, the sooner the nation grapples with these challenges, the lower the cost and the lower the amount of human suffering. The sea level will continue to rise regardless of the course we choose. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. We will now turn to my fellow Rhode Islander, Kate Michaud. I should say that my time in judiciary is about to begin. Senator Kaine is here, who will chair for me when I go down to judiciary, which I probably will at the end of Kate's testimony. I want to thank our Appropriations Chair and President Pro Tem, Patty Murray, for joining us. And if I'm not back in time for the first round of questions, I would let Senator Kaine and Senator Murray be the two lead-offs since they are here, and then the list is Van Hollen and Padilla. With that, Ms. Michaud, thank you for being here. Welcome to Washington.
Thank you. Thank you to Chairman Whitehouse and Ranking Member Grassley and to the distinguished members of the committee for allowing me to address you today. My name is Kate Michaud, and I'm the town manager of the town of Warren, which, as Senator Whitehouse mentioned, is the smallest town in the smallest county in the smallest state in the nation. The town of Warren is the location of the seat of the historic region of Soames, where the Massasoit Osamequin once welcomed a delegation of pilgrims, including Edward Winslow and Stephen Hopkins. Warren's prime location, featuring 18 miles of waterfront land, allowed for a thriving shipbuilding industry, commercial shell fishing, and other marine-based businesses. Over time, manufacturing has taken over as the town's top employer, with a diverse array of companies, including defense contractors, composite industry leaders, and consumer goods producers. Along with the rest of the state, housing density has increased to provide for the workforce that has followed job creation. In 2022, Rhode Island was the second most densely populated state, with the majority of residents living near its 400 miles of coastline. Warren is no different, but Warren is changing. Warren's coastal proximity and flat elevation, averaging 7 feet or less in the most densely populated areas of town, has rendered the town especially vulnerable to the effects of coastal flooding and climate change. What is happening and what is predicted to happen in our most vulnerable coastal areas is significant. And while Warrenites are tirelessly self-reliant, it is beyond our ability to simply cope. In 2017, the town of Warren undertook a major wastewater treatment facility upgrade project to increase capacity and improve water quality. As the stewards of the taxpayers' funds, the town undertook a cost-benefit analysis of the equipment that was to be installed to ensure that it would be viable for the life of the asset. With assistance from our engineers, state agencies, the University of Rhode Island, and utilizing NOAA data, a conservative estimate of 3 feet of sea level rise was adopted for the design horizon of 2065. Facility upgrades were completed in 2022 at a cost of $21.7 million, borne by the local taxpayers. Viability of the facility beyond 3 feet of sea level rise is unlikely. As a result of the study completed for the wastewater improvements, the town determined that there was a pressing need to calculate the potential future impacts of coastal flooding on our other critical municipal infrastructure and on the town's tax base. Efforts have focused on our Market Street area, which is a 184-acre district containing approximately 700 housing units, mostly multifamily rental housing, as well as 30 businesses. The area currently has a total assessed value of $138 million, or just over 10% of the assessed value of the total town. A no-action scenario was developed, predicting what would happen with no efforts to mitigate the rising waters. The data analysis concluded that by the year 2100, 306 of the area's 400 buildings could be lost permanently to the rising water, with a loss in value of more than $85 million in today's dollars, or more than 60% of the total assessed value of the area. A 24-inch storm surge on top of the predicted sea level rise, not extreme for a coastal hurricane or nor'easter, could result in an additional $52 million in flood damage and $126 million in lost business revenue. For reference, the hurricane of 1938 brought 10 to 12 feet of storm surge to Rhode Island. With just 3 feet of sea level rise, predicted to be experienced locally within the next 30 years, 3 of the town's major roads, including the primary evacuation route, would be flooded with salt water and impassable every day at high tide. These roads are already experiencing significant effects of sunny day flooding, occurring during the seasonal high tides in the spring and fall. Stormwater systems intended to drain precipitation away from the populated areas are instead operating in reverse, bringing tidal water into the inland areas, flooding roads, parking lots, and even homes. Underground tidal action has washed out the road base on at least one local road, causing a partial collapse and hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage to underground utilities. While we are just starting to fully understand the potential cost of damage to public assets, we know we will need additional resources beyond what we can make available, and we are looking to federal resources to help us to assess and prepare, including FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program and the National Coastal Resilience Fund. I have been invited here today not because Warren is unique in its vulnerability, but because it is a microcosm of the hundreds of small coastal communities in this country, all populated with hardworking residents and business owners. Warren is not a playground of the rich. It is not a tourism hotspot. The homes that line our shores are not vacation homes of little consequence. I am here not because I am trying to take a cutting-edge approach to local governance, but because one of my most basic duties is to prepare my community for the realities of the future. I am concerned about financial limits to the taxpayers. I am concerned about the bonding agencies. I am concerned about what happens when the financial industry decides that a 30-year mortgage in my town is too great a risk to take. I thank you for this opportunity to address you today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud. The next witness is appearing virtually, and it's Dr. Wankel. Please proceed and correct me if I got your name mispronounced, please.
No, that was fine. Thank you. All right. Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for enabling me to visit with you today. It is a great honor. Today, I share my perspective on the interface of climate change science, economics of coastal risk, and policy. As one born and raised on Miami Beach and now living in coastal Wilmington, North Carolina, coastal risk is a personal and professional concern of mine. What I have found in my nearly 20 years of research on the interface of climate change science and policy is what most people find in protracted areas of policymaking: money, power, and a system of social relationships that creates a community of mutually beneficial shared assumptions. Climate change science is big business and big politics, and it is used to advocate for new ways of shaping the foundational components of our economy. And today, it does not just engage with the biggest names in finance, it engages with decision makers on the scaffolding that is the institution of finance. This is not inherently problematic. Expertise is invaluable for decision makers to understand public problems and develop a range of actionable options to alleviate those problems. What is problematic, however, is when scientific integrity is undermined in pursuit of financial and political gain. This is indeed what has happened in the field of climate change science. The most commonly used emission scenarios in climate change research are grossly implausible or at the upper bounds of plausible. By implausible, I mean that CO2 emissions projections embedded in the scenarios do not reflect observation or the state of knowledge about energy markets in the global economy. Today, it is not easy to separate the going-ons in climate change research from the special interests of financial institutions. As an analogy, we can say, and indeed we know, much the same about the relationship between biomedical research and the pharmaceutical industry. The landscape of climate change research is made complicated by an outcropping of nonprofit advocacy organizations that double as analytic consultants, hold contracts with private companies and government entities, and engage in official government expert advisory roles, all while publishing in the peer-reviewed literature and creating media storms. This is not really an issue of any one entity, though. It is pervasive. And again, much like other areas of research, such as pharmaceuticals, it is not inherently unusual. It is not unusual. But it does require policymakers to take a step back to understand what they were really looking at when they receive information about the economics of climate change risk. Disclosure practices must be improved across the board, from climate science journals to scientific professional organizations to the development of national climate assessment reports and other places climate sciences are used in official advisory positions to policymakers. I have 5 points to share with the committee. Number one, at the outset, I affirm that climate change is real and it is important. Policies that reduce human impacts on local, regional, and global climate demonstrate a commitment to the well-being and security of our communities and future generations. Number two, social factors are the leading cause in historical increases in the cost of coastal loss events related to weather and climate extremes. Growth in population along the coast, the associated concentration of wealth, and inflation explain the historical increases in the cost of coastal loss events. Number three, practical policy responses for reducing the costs and human suffering associated with coastal disasters would directly address underlying vulnerabilities in the built environment and within the most vulnerable communities. This approach also offers robustness and resilience to future climate change. The decision to use climate change as a focal point for discussing coastal disasters is a decision to deflect attention from the social and political causes of vulnerability and loss. Number four, reducing coastal risk makes good sense, and it is also difficult. It is imperative that policymakers are working with plausible scenarios of future risk. This is a very basic rule of policy analysis. And finally, to reiterate, climate change science demonstrates an underappreciated dynamic system of conflicts of interest among climate change researchers, advocacy organizations, and the financial industry. Thank you.
Dr. Lewis. Please turn your microphone on if you can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Senators, for inviting me to testify today on behalf of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We're a nonprofit research organization with a focus on regulatory policy, and we are dedicated to promoting economic liberty and free enterprise. I was really impressed with the testimonies I've heard so far, and one theme that I think I hear in common in all of them, which was in my testimony, and I'm quite pleased with this because I'm not a professional civil engineer of any sort or urban planner, is the importance of adaptation. A lot of attribution has been placed on climate change by for these risks to coastal communities by most of the witnesses, and I was surprised, but also pleased that nobody decided to promote emission reduction as a cure. In fact, Mr. Bicchetti said the seas are going to rise regardless of what we do. I guess I would qualify that just a little bit in saying that when it comes to sea level rise damages, what's really more important than global sea level rise, which, as one of the previous witnesses said, I think it was Dr. Bicchetti, has only been about 6 to 10 inches over the last century, is relative sea level rise, the relationship between the sea level and the coastline. And this can be massively influenced by changes in the level of the land. Water withdrawals, the withdrawals of fossil fuels from coastal areas, all of those can result in a sinking or subsidence of the land. So can the rebound from the disappearance of the glaciers, although that can also raise the land level in relation to the sea. But if it is in fact the case that sea levels, say in Rhode Island, are going to rise by 3 feet in just the next 30 years, that is not due to global climate change. Only a small part of that would be. That would be to more local factors. One point that I want to stress that is in my testimony is the marvelous power of adaptation. Human beings have this remarkable capacity for adaptation. And I would hope that this would extend also to protection against the property damages from relative sea level rise primarily, but also to some extent just from global sea level rise. And what I'm talking about, for example, is that since the 1920s, the average mortality, the average number of deaths globally by decade from all kinds of weather-related hazards, snowstorms, heat waves, drought's the biggest killer, but that has declined by 96% over the last 100 years. That's really quite phenomenal. And if you consider that there has been a fourfold increase in global population, it actually means that the average person in the world today has 99.4% less risk of being killed by extreme weather than the average person in the 1920s. Now, some people say, not at this panel, but I think we've all heard people say that, well, the weather is becoming more destructive, and that explains why property damages are rising. And in fact, usually that's due to a failure to normalize the loss data for changes in population, for changes in property values. For example, the Florida coastline has increased by something like 67 times since 1900. So it stands to reason that a hurricane that hits in Dade or Broward County today would do a great deal more damage than one that hit, say, only 40 years ago. The same hurricane, that is. But this, I think, is a fascinating study
And Dr. Lewis, you're over your time, so if you could try to summarize.
Yes, I will.
Conclude.
That there has been basically a five-fold decrease since the 1980s in the relative impact of extreme weather of all kinds globally. And that also is a testament to this amazing power of adaptation. And to sustain that adaptation, we need to keep the economy growing. We need to keep it dynamic. We need to keep, therefore, what moves the economy, what powers it, available and accessible and affordable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will begin with questions, and I will ask Senator Murray to start us off.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Appreciate that, and I want to thank the Chairman and Senator Grassley, Ranking Member, for holding this hearing, and also to our witnesses who are here today to talk about this. I really do appreciate this hearing today. It's given us the chance to dive deeper into the budgetary costs related to climate change, because this is costing billions, if not trillions of dollars a year. Because let's, I think, be clear, the climate crisis is here, it's expensive, and that is just the plain truth. In my home state of Washington, more than 65% of our population lives in coastal areas. And these communities are on the front line of this crisis. We have already seen in my state rising sea levels, increased flooding, and storm surge risk. It does real damage to our working waterfronts, to our community infrastructure, to our housing supply, and the coastal ecosystem that support our fisheries. And we know this will be felt unevenly, depending on where you live and what resources you have available. So my first question is for you, Ms. Michaud, and thank you for your testimony. Can you talk about the types of investments that your town has already had to make to respond to and prepare for this coastal flooding, and how those assessments are impacting your current infrastructure decisions?
Sure. I think the biggest impact so far has been to our wastewater system. I referenced the wastewater treatment facility upgrade project, which was a $21.7 million project, which may not sound like a lot of money, but our total annual budget is just around $25 million. And the debt service on that debt for that wastewater project is approximately 18% of our annual operating budget, which is considerable. We have recently entered into a public-private partnership with a housing developer to upgrade one of our pump stations. That The cost to elevate and refurbish that pump station was right around $4 million. We have 10 pump stations in total, so we have some work still to do. And we are also performing a number of what are called end-of-road retrofits. So we have roads that formerly went to the coast, straight down to the coastline. They're now flooding frequently at high tides. So what we are doing is working with engineers to pull the pavement back from the edge of the road, create kind of a soft barrier to eliminate the erosion that we're seeing. So those are costly projects, and there are many of them. We've completed, I believe, 4, and we have many more to go. So that's just a sample. We have a lot more infrastructure projects that we need to take a look at, and they do significantly impact our budget. It's a budget that is, like I said, very small. We're a small town, just over 11,000 residents, and those residents are already bearing the burden of that cost.
Well, thank you for that. And as an example about how this is actually straining communities in Washington State and the difficult decisions that are having to be made, the Quinault Indian Nation on the Olympic Peninsula in my state has already begun to experience the effects of sea level rise and in those intense storm surges we're seeing. They've had damaging floods and landslides and did a climate vulnerability assessment. And as a result of that, the tribe developed a very comprehensive relocation plan, and it involves relocating the tribe's lower village of Tahola to higher elevation because of the impacts they're seeing. That's going to involve an emergency evacuation center. It's going to move a significant portion of the tribal infrastructure inland away from the Quinault River and the Pacific Ocean that the tribe has always depended on for their sustenance as well. Last year, they did get a $25 million through our bipartisan infrastructure law to begin this costly process, and they are not alone in having to take a really hard look at what the current sea level rise is happening to communities around our country. And I think a lot of people are asking, how are we going to be able to avoid the loss of life and property and be able to make these investments? So, Mr. Eby, my question actually I want to direct to you. Talk to us about the budgetary impacts that such large-scale relocation efforts in the future could have for our communities and for our economy.
Yeah, thank you for your leadership on this subject and for the question, Senator. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, the Quinault Indian Nation is not unique in this situation. The managed retreat that's happening, where they're moving to higher land and the relocation of critical infrastructure and assets, is something that we're seeing in multiple states and something that has to unfortunately take place when we look at the cost-benefit ratio of staying in certain places and the overall risk that is faced. So, unfortunately, as this is not unique, it's extremely costly. When we look at the critical infrastructure that's involved, as I was talking about with Ms. Michard, and what's going on in different counties and states across the state, it is extremely costly to undergo these versus just building in the first place to a standard that allows us to understand what will happen from risk today and into the future. So while unfortunately I can't give you a specific number on how managed retreat in these typical situations will cost us as a country, I can tell you that it's much, much more expensive to try and do these things retroactively than to actually manage these things from the beginning and use climate-adjusted forecast to then change building code standards or to make these decisions at the forefront.
Well, thank you very much. And again, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Absolutely. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it Mr. Eby or Eby?
It's Eby.
Eby, Mr. Eby or Mr. Bicchetti. Mr. Eby in particular, you've gone to great length of making all kinds of cost estimates, pretty high detail. Do either of you know how much we've already spent in the U.S. and globally to combat climate change? Do you know what that number is?
I do not, Senator.
Anybody on the panel have any idea how much we've already spent, how much we've committed, either in the U.S. or globally? I mean, my point being is, wouldn't that be a really important number to know to compare to what the damages might be? Again, going to adaptation. Dr. Weinkel, I think you're the only environmental scientist on the panel here. I've seen estimates that if we were to reduce or eliminate CO2 in the U.S. or in the West, it would have a negligible impact on average temperatures over the next 100 years or so. Is that true?
Oh, that specific question goes well beyond sort of my area of expertise in coastal risk. The cost of emission scenarios and on all that.
Okay, Dr. Lewis has raised his hand. Do you have a?
Yes, I do. Not. There.
You're on now,
okay,
yeah.
Sorry. Yes, in fact, in my testimony, I reference a study done by Kevin Diaratna of the Heritage Foundation. He's a PhD data scientist and statistician. And what he did is he just took the EPA's climate policy calculator model, it's acronymed MAGIC, and decided to take a look at what happens to global temperatures at various assumed climate sensitivities. He went all the way from the assumption that it's 1.5,
get the
4.5,
bottom line here.
And basically, if you instantaneously and completely eliminate U.S. CO2 emissions today, and basically, if you take the middle range sensitivity assumption, then you avert about 0.2 of a degree Celsius of global warming by the year 2100.
So again, I believe we probably spent hundreds of billions. I think we're contemplating spending trillions of dollars to do something that we can't do. Again, we recognize in just 20,000 years or less, I mean, it's a blink of the eye in terms of geologic time. The sea levels increased by 390 feet in the Bay of San Francisco. We can't spend enough money. We can't hold back the tides. So this is where the Bjorn Lomborg approach comes into effect. We're far better off spending resources adapting, as opposed to this insane quest to conquer climate change, which we can't do. Again, climate has always changed, always will. So let's spend the resources properly. I also want to talk a little bit about how the cure is worse than the disease. I didn't get it done in time, but I had a photo I was going to show of I don't know how many hundreds of miners in the Congo mining cobalt. And a lot of these are children. Does anybody here have any estimates of how much more copper we're going to have to mine? How much more cobalt we're going to have to mine? How much more lithium we're going to have to mine? How many rare earth minerals we're going to have to mine? What's the impact on the environment of that? What about the unreliability of our grid? Mr. Eby, have you done calculations of that? When because wind and solar are not reliable, you need backup. Have you done any cost calculations of how much it's going to cost when a grid shuts down because of unreliability?
We focus on the economic damages of physical climate change, so not the reliability of the grid or renewable resources.
So again, we are ignoring the main factors here. There's nothing we can do, literally, to combat climate change, particularly when China and India aren't on board, and they never will be on board. So we could spend hundreds of billions, have no impact, waste hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars. We're far better off spending that money to adapt. And we also have to fully realize the cost, the environmental cost of all the additional mining, and understand that it's just not possible to meet these climate change. I mean, you can't end fossil fuels in 10 years. It's impossible. It would impoverish our nation. Why are we even talking about it? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, for the record, let me just say I have a different view than those statements, and I think most people do. Let me turn now to Senator Kaine, and then we'll turn to Senator Padilla. Senator Kaine is living with this as the Navy looks at Naval Station Norfolk and the flooding in that area and what it portends for his base. So I'm grateful to him for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to all the witnesses for being here. And I want to talk about Norfolk. Before I do that, I have a question for Dr. Weinkel. I was reviewing your written testimony as well as your verbal testimony, and one of your fifth point is a dynamic system of conflicts of interest among climate change researchers, advocacy organizations, and financial industry anchors the use of implausible emissions scenarios. And you have a quote in the written testimony that I think all of us would agree with. Researcher conflicts of interest, especially when undisclosed, undermines scientific integrity and threatens public trust in science. But as I read your testimony and listened to it, you didn't mention anything about the fossil fuel industry. You focused on the financial industry and advocacy organizations. Is there some reason why you've omitted reference to the fossil fuel industry, which often is involved in research that is frequently undisclosed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I do link to that. I have a reference to it in my written testimony. And one of the most notable works on that area, Merchants of Doubt, became a movie. It's not that I omitted it. What I said and what I believe is that we've done a very good job in pointing out these conflicts of interest in that area. But we have a tendency to turn a blind eye to it when it's coming from other areas.
All right, well, I'm going to move on to Norfolk now, but I just found it striking that your testimony focused on the financial industry and climate advocacy organizations, and in my view, omitted, you could characterize it differently, omitted reference to fossil fuel research, which has frequently undisclosed and has, I think, vastly dominated, outnumbered some of the other research. But let me move to Norfolk. The Hampton Roads area in Virginia is 1.7 million people. It's the second largest metropolitan area in our Commonwealth. Historic area, very diverse. Jamestown Island, where English settlement of North America began, no offense to the Pilgrims. The biggest Navy base in the world, Norfolk Naval Base, Chesapeake Bay, very dynamic economy. And yet the sea level effects in Norfolk are not future effects. We're seeing them every day. We have communities in the Chesapeake Bay like Tangier Island that could well disappear. But I have a question for you, Dr. Becchetti. According to a recent report by the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, the low estimates of sea level rise indicate that approximately 59,000 residential homes in the Hampton Roads region will be permanently or regularly inundated by the end of the century. And if you look at the high estimates of sea level rise that are consensus in Virginia, including the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, about 175,000 homes will be permanently or regularly inundated. Your former employer, Freddie Mac, has estimated that the total losses to coastal real estate, quote, are likely to be greater in total than those experienced during the housing crisis and Great Recession. What would a drop in property values of this magnitude mean for the financial situations of families living in these homes? And this is just one metropolitan area in the United States.
Well, obviously, it would be a very catastrophic event. I think Mr. Eby presented some evidence about property overvaluation, current overvaluation of coastal properties, where people are not realizing the risk that they're facing in the future. And the question that stimulated me to get involved in this area at all was we had just lived through 2007 and 08 and the many years of recovery, which we haven't completely recovered from that yet. And we had many years where we said, you know, these house price rises they can't be sustained. This is just people are starting to believe that they're printing money and there's no risk. And eventually, for whatever reason that triggered it, all of a sudden, the house of cards collapsed. And there is a fear that something similar could happen in this issue.
If I could, I have one more question. I want to get into Mr.
Sure.
Eby if I can. So with respect to our naval base, the estimates on the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan suggest that under NOAA's intermediate risk scenarios, 25,000 acres of DoD facilities in the Commonwealth of Virginia will be in the 100-year floodplain or risk year, and by 2080, that number climbs to 31,000 acres of DoD facilities in Virginia. Has the First Street Foundation undertaken an assessment of flood risk for our nation's military assets?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator Kane, and thank you for your leadership on the topic. And unfortunately, the naval base, and the assets in the region are not unique in the sense that there's already 344,000 properties that have a 1% annual chance of risk or greater today in your state, and that's growing by over 13% in just 30 years. And so when we look at the actual infrastructure of the military, a lot of the things that we need to look at to understand the inoperability or risk are confidential. So things like at what height would the docks be for the ships to be able to actually be manageable and be able to go out to sea. But what we can see are things like the single road that goes to our naval base that becomes impassable under certain events today, let alone on how that's.
Yeah, not even during storm surge, just during
Exactly.
normal tidal action. It's frequent, and it's growing more frequent. I'm over my time. Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
For what it's worth, the former commander of Naval Station Norfolk, the naval officer who was in charge of it, has actually predicted that that base will have to go out of service for this very reason. That's coming from the United States Navy. Senator Padilla is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Morning to the witnesses. My home state of California has one of the longest coastlines, stretching 840 miles from the Oregon border to Mexico. And of the nearly 40 million people who live in California, 26.3 million of them live in what are considered coastal communities. And according to NOAA, coastal California employs more than 12 million people annually, which translates into $2 trillion in GDP. Those are big numbers. But I share that because all of that is at risk with rising sea levels. And it's not just the economic impact that we must grapple with. A recent study by UC Berkeley and UCLA mapped the more than 400 facilities with hazardous materials that will experience flooding events by the end of the century, including power plants, refineries, industrial facilities, and hazardous waste sites, many of which are located not just in coastal regions, but specifically in disadvantaged communities in the coastal regions. A 3-foot sea level rise will flood 15 wastewater treatment plants in California. Facilities in the San Francisco Bay region are particularly vulnerable, with rising groundwater levels magnifying flood risk. With all that being said, question is for Mr. Eby. What does your modeling demonstrate about the particular risk for low-income or disadvantaged communities located near aging facilities and infrastructure?
Thank you very much for the question. And as you noted, California is particularly at risk with over 1 million properties that have that similar 1% risk that I was just talking about, growing another 5.5% over the next 30 years. And unfortunately, with that comes the assessments of those that are at risk. So to your question of, are we seeing a higher instance of vulnerabilities around the LMI population? The answer is yes. One of our partners, Redfin, a real estate company, used our data in partnership to look at this exact question and found that there's $107 billion in home value at risk of flooding in formerly red-line districts compared to $85 billion in home value at risk from those that were deemed kind of more desirable for lending. And what you're able to see when you look at economic impact per square foot or value of the home, when you see lower value homes and the cost of flooding that goes against them, you see a higher percentage of the home value that is at risk than the more affluent areas across the country. So we see this time and time again by looking at our data that the LMI population is much more at risk and much more exposed and much less likely to be insured, unfortunately, from these events as well.
Thank you. Would welcome your input and feedback as it pertains to, as a result, federal investments in some of these areas to address not just issues of physical impact of sea level rise, but the equity lens that should accompany it. We've also had our fair share of natural disasters in California in recent years. The recent California flooding and severe weather led to anywhere between $5 and $7 billion in total U.S. economic losses, according to new estimates from Moody's. We face a special kind of weather whiplash in California, where we cycle back and forth from the worst mega drought in 1,200 years, followed by storm events and extreme flood impacts. Y'all heard about the blizzard warnings in Southern California this last weekend. Under scenarios of 3 feet to 6 feet of sea level rise, up to 2/3 of Southern California beaches may become completely eroded also by the end of the century. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers plays a particularly important role in protecting communities from extreme floods and rising sea levels, but also in beach nourishment projects that are ongoing and require sustained federal investments. Back to you, Mr. Eby. Can you speak to the way your climate modeling looks at risks collectively across fire, heat, flooding, and wind, given that many parts of California experience all of the above?
Yeah. Again, thank you for the question. And with our models, we've created individual versions, high-resolution models to be able to look at these exact questions. So what is the exposure to extreme heat? What is the exposure to hurricane winds? What is the exposure to wildfires and flooding? And in California, specifically, each one of those is represented across the state as current and increasing risk from climate change. We haven't combined these into one overall score or risk or quantification for the state, but I can tell you that individually each one poses a risk overall. Similarly with flooding, especially with things like atmospheric rivers and the severe precipitation that we've seen this year that impacts all of these homes that are outside the FEMA flood zone and the FEMA special flood hazard area. These are just some of the things that we're seeing today that we know are going to be exacerbated in the future from all of these different perils.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your expertise and for participation this morning. Look forward to following up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. I'll take a few moments myself, and if you don't mind, I'm going to start with Dr. Weinkel. Dr. Weinkel, you live in North Carolina, I gather?
Yes, I do.
And North Carolina's Coastal Resources Commission has estimated a decade ago that the sea level along the North Carolina shore would raise 39 inches in coming years. Do you challenge that finding by your state Coastal Resources Commission?
I'm not challenging their finding, but I am saying that the emission scenarios that they've used in the past, and they've been used by a lot of people, and they are commonly used, face a lot of challenges in that they've been found to be largely implausible, particularly the upper bound ones.
So,
not largely, wholly.
but clearly they've used other data that you have confidence in if they've decided that they've got 39 inches of sea level rise and you're not challenging their finding. Right? So you're challenging a segment of the data that they used, but you're not challenging the 39 inches finding. Is that correct?
I'm challenging the wisdom of using the emission scenarios that they use to find.
Some of them, the ones that you contend are exaggerated.
Yes.
Why is it that in 12 pages of testimony in a hearing on the impact of sea level rise on local communities and on the economy, does your testimony never use the phrase sea level rise? Or admit that your own state is looking at 39 inches of sea level rise?
That's a good question. And I had it in. The reason is because I know enough to know that the science of sea level rise is nuanced. It is increasing, but it largely understanding it and understanding its impacts on different areas requires a level of expertise about sea level rise and the dynamics.
You think the Navy has that level of expertise? Do you think the United States Navy has adequate expertise to make determinations about the safety and future of its own coastal bases?
I'm sure they have very intelligent people.
Yeah, okay. To go back to Senator Kane's questioning, and just to be clear about this, would funding of research or expert opinion by fossil fuel interests implicate your concerns about conflict of interest?
Would, of course.
Okay. And would the concerns about conflict of interest be worsened if the fossil fuel funding of the research or the expert opinion was undisclosed?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, let me turn to Mr. Lewis, who is here on behalf of Competitive Enterprise Institute. This is at least the fourth time, Mr. Lewis, that you have appeared to bring climate skepticism on behalf of Republican colleagues to hearings. You have said in the past that climate change could actually be a net good for people. You've also said, and I'm quoting you here from an NPR radio show where the host asked you, in response to questions about climate change and sea level rise, the question to you was, so you're saying move New York, move Miami, move Southern Florida, move Boston? And your response was yes. So given the kind of eccentric nature of your testimony, I'm interested in following up on your other Republican witnesses' advice and finding out how much fossil fuel funding goes into the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
Sure. Well, let me address that question first, which is, I don't know that, and
you don't know that because it comes through a group called Donors Trust, which hides the real donor and screens who the original donor is. But if Competitive Enterprise Institute wished to, it could have a policy of requiring that the actual donor be disclosed rather than the identity laundering shop of Donors Trust, correct?
But our policy is that we protect the privacy of our donors, whoever they are. And
Which
so
runs right into the conflict of interest problem,
you're
right?
asking us to violate our policy, which is based on Supreme Court decisions.
Exceedingly convenient policy. My time is up, and it's now Senator Braun and then Senator Van Hollen. Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Grassley.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Dr. Winkle.
And then Van Hollen, and then.
Dr. Winkle, you're an environmental scientist. A few questions for you. Have you found climate change to be the primary cause of natural disaster damage on our coast?
The primary drivers of loss along the coast is the increasing population, the wealth that they bring with it, and inflation.
Have you found? Go ahead.
I would just add those coastal areas are engines of U.S. GDP. They're very valuable to us, but with that comes a lot at risk.
Okay. Have you found an upward trend in extreme weather events over time?
So my personal analysis has been limited to hurricane landfalls, and over the long record, 1900 to today, there is no long-term increasing trend in frequency or severity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
Okay. While headline costs for extreme weather events appear larger, to what extent is that attributable to more buildings and wealth continuing to migrate to coastal communities, and have local governments exacerbated the problem by encouraging that sort of development?
So on the development issue, as it's complicated, housing, development, all that is a very important component to the U.S. economy. So we have a tendency to protect it and pursue it. As we know, somebody had mentioned the crisis not so long in 2007, the housing crisis. When housing collapses for an area or the state or the nation, it's a problem, large scale. So we support it. And then as far as the rules around development, there's a lot of reasons why we develop as we do. There's a lot of private property right protections that limit the ability for the state to interact and restrict building, as well as it's very difficult to hold local planners accountable to national level objectives because of because of our federalism system. And while that's very valuable to us, and while we hold that close to who we are as Americans, it does create challenges in a system of accountability.
Dr. Lewis, this committee has heard from proponents of instituting a carbon tax to address emissions. Could you share your perspective on a carbon tax and its effect on Americans, the economy, and whether or not it helps the environment?
Yes, well, a carbon tax is either all pain for no gain or it's a cure worse than the disease. There was a paper in Nature Climate Change that came out last year by Peng et al., and this is not a fossil-fueled climate skeptic. This is someone who actually likes emission control policies and very stringent emission controls, but he calculated that even if you had a carbon tax in excess of $1,500 a ton, you could only get about 80% of the way to net zero emissions. And so he recommended a carbon tax that was even higher, even though this would represent basically a cost of 11.9% of GDP. It would be a $4.4 trillion tax bill by the time you got to 2050, which would translate into a burden on the average person of something like $11,300. And so that would definitely harm the economy, which would harm our standards of living and basically cripple the United States economically so that we could not duplicate the marvelous feats of adaptation that has reduced the average person's risk of dying from extreme weather by 99.4% over the last century, which was chiefly fossil fueled. And just for the record, I'd like to point out that that yes answer that I gave on NPR was not what I think Senator Whitehouse understood me to say, which is that cities could just sprout wings and fly. My point was that cities are dynamic organizations and they change, and parts of the cities grow where other parts can contract, or it can just be in terms of population or where industry is located. They're quite organic, and so there's a lot of internal movement within cities and around cities. That's what I was getting at.
I will submit the rest of my questions for answer in writing.
Thanks. Now, I messed up and jumped in when I came back from the judiciary hearing, and I took your spot, Chairman, so my apologies. But that means that it's now Mike Braun's turn for questions, followed by Senator Van Hollen. My apologies for stepping in out of line.
Mr. Chairman, you're forgiven, okay?
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for having the hearing. So this is the Budget Committee, and I've got a couple questions, one for Dr. Lewis and then for Dr. Becchetti. But this is analogous to other conversations we've had here in the Budget Committee, which would not be directly related to our jurisdiction. And I do want to cite that whatever we discuss here, I'm very interested in being in the climate conversation. I think if we aren't on our side of the aisle, that you're probably just avoiding the issue. I've lived a life of a conservationist, and I think it's important. But I'll refer to one of my favorite quotes that I've ever heard here, and it's unrelated to this today, but it comes from Admiral Mike Mullen when he so succinctly said, "I'm more afraid of the red ink than the red menace." Okay? And that's got applicability right now as we're looking at other issues out there. The CBO, who I've gotten to know pretty well, work with them whenever I think they're not being forthcoming on how things are trending. All I can tell you is we were $5 trillion in debt, I think, in 2000. After the Bush stint, we were $10 trillion in debt. After the Obama administration, we were $16 trillion in debt. That takes us to 2016. 2018, we added another trillion each year, and now literally the wheels have fallen off the budget train. And it's sad to think that we're $31 trillion in debt. And there's actually a government estimate in 2033 that we're $46 trillion in debt. What I'm saying is, regardless of what we talk about here, we ought to say we're borrowing it from our kids and grandkids if we want to do anything on climate, we want to do anything on anything in this government, when each year we're borrowing now close to 30% of what we spend in an operating budget. Anybody could do that. No other entity operates that way. And I think that is going to be the big issue in the long run, because let's just say we do nail down something where we need to invest the money. We're going to have a balance sheet that's going to be increasingly difficult to do it. And if you're good at math, take 1% of 30 trillion, 300 billion, take 4% of 30 trillion, 1.2 trillion. That is what we're going to price in to the carrying cost of this dereliction of duty. We need to keep that in mind, and I do wish, Mr. Chairman, that we would probably get back to some budget mechanics, some type of regular order, so that the end result each year isn't a 4,100-page bill that gets dropped into our lap with 2 days to look at it, for the just 1/3 of what we spend each year that's even subject to a budget that we don't do. So my question now is on this subject, which I'm very interested in. We're doing good things in this country. I think we've set the example. The EU is, maybe Australia, maybe Japan. What sense does it make for us to do any of this, which does have an economic consequence, when China, India, most of the underdeveloped and undeveloped world is paying no attention to it? Does it make sense, especially when you can't nail down the particulars of when all this is going to come in and have great impact? We know it may someday, but the one thing that's absolute, we know that if you do these kinds of things, it is a cost to our own economy. Please comment, Dr. Bacchetti and then Dr. Lewis, on why this makes sense when over half the world, China, India, building coal-fired plants nearly weekly.
Oh, thank you for the question. Part of what you're asking is outside my range of experience. And in fact, the points that I was making in my testimony was how to adapt to climate change that is going to occur over the next 30 years. So we know how costly the housing finance crisis was in 2007 and 2008. Multi-year costs, many people suffered a lot of damages. And as I look at the situation, you can predict where stresses will occur in the housing finance system. Housing finance system is a very complex way of making sure that risks are allocated to the firms that can handle them correctly. And these are risks that they're not ready for. So from a budget point of view, the sooner we figure out how to have a successful adaptation to something that we can't avoid will save us money.
Dr. Lewis.
I think that's a very good answer. I would say you've painted a picture that scares me more than climate change, which is the unsustainability of,
and that should be the point, because
right.
It's an absolute in the present.
And it seems to me that, you know, given the difficulty in scaling back government programs, because as soon as you create a program, you create dependency on the program, and that just results in more lobbying for the program. That the only solution, if there is one, that eventually that in the long term prevents us falling off a financial cliff, a fiscal cliff, is economic growth. And so the government's top priority, domestic priority, I would suggest, is to encourage economic growth, sustained economic growth, by trying to find every conceivable impediment to enterprise there is and abolishing it, deregulating it, whatever has to be done. But that's not, you can't do that if your top priority is reducing emissions by attacking the fossil fuel industry. You can't combine those things. And I think it's a fool's hope that somehow if we subsidize renewables enough, they'll become so competitive on their own that they will drive the economic engine of this country.
Thank you. And not to mention that the rest of the world's not on the same page we are in a few other countries. Troubles me. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Braun. And a moment of chairman privilege, I do look forward to working with you, and Senator Van Hollen and Senator Kane are also here and have been very interested and helpful in trying to figure out how we reform the Budget Committee process to more clearly address the concerns that you have at the moment. We simply just are forbidden to get the arithmetic right of the deficit and debt problems that we face. We need to fix that, and I intend to.
Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just listening to the conversation, a couple points. I look forward to Senator Braun's point to having a budget debate. President Biden's budget will arrive here in Congress soon. He's indicated that his budget will reduce deficits over 10 years by $2 trillion. So I look forward to alternative proposals from the House or otherwise on that important issue. Second, you know, I was listening to some of the comments by Dr. Lewis. I think it'd be important to know that in the most recent hearing we had in this Budget Committee on climate change, it was some of our Republican colleagues who said that they didn't like the Inflation Reduction Act because they wanted to approach the issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by putting a price on carbon, something that I too support, and of course puts the burden on those who are the polluters in dealing with that, what economists call externality that impacts everybody else, as you know. So those were statements from some of our Republican colleagues just in the last hearing. I would like to say a word about China, who actually has a 10-year lead on the United States when it comes to investment in the batteries that are used for storage for electric vehicles. They process more of the critical minerals that go into electric vehicle batteries. They produce a lot of them. And given the fact that there's a growing market for that, I would hope that we wouldn't want to fall behind China, whose 10-year plan more than 10 years ago said that one of their #1 priorities was to be the dominant world player when it comes to clean energy. So, you know, we're talking about having to address the costs now of doing nothing, right? The costs of emissions that are having impacts in sea level rise and other areas. And so I want to start by thanking you, Ms. Michaud, for sharing your experiences about how you in Rhode Island have been navigating issues of sea level rise. In my state of Maryland, we're experiencing lots of costs and impacts from climate change and sea level rise. There's a small town in Kent County, which is on Maryland's eastern shore. It's called Betterton. It was once a really thriving little town. The Baltimore to Betterton beach ferries went back and forth from the city of Baltimore to this town. But right now, they're having to spend $1 million to protect just 10 homes from literally falling into the bay. And the homeowners are putting in some, but so are public entities putting in some because this cost was no fault of the homeowners. That's expensive. Can you just talk to the issues you're facing when it comes to a small town trying to fight the growing costs of climate change?
Sure, thank you for the question. I mean, I believe Warren is similar to many small towns around the country in that we have increasing needs, not just climate related, but also social related and economic development related, and it's a very tough competition for the small amount of funds that we have. So again, we are spending considerably to protect our coastal features and our coastal facilities, but sometimes it is at the expense of other items, such as social services or education or other infrastructure improvements that are needed that aren't in the coastal areas. So it's certainly a concern. You know, as I said, we are very small. The town hall in Warren, we have 14 employees from the custodian to myself, and I think that we are not dissimilar to many other communities that have limited resources and limited staff to deal with those problems.
It sounds like the same challenge being experienced by a lot of these towns on Maryland's eastern shore. Dr. Becchetti, in your article entitled "Life's a Beach," you note that a large share of homeowners' wealth is locked up in their equity in their homes, and that the Union of Concerned Scientists has also published a report called Underwater, which I know you're familiar with. That report, the Union of Concerned Scientists report, estimates that nearly 2,500 homes in Somerset County, Maryland, which is another county on Maryland's eastern shore, with a market value, the 2,500 homes with a market value of $200 million are at risk of chronic flooding in 2030. Can you just speak to the impact of lost property values due to in coastal communities like Somerset? This is just one small area. You magnify that across our state of Maryland, across the country. Can you just speak to the magnitude of this challenge?
Well, it's a particularly difficult challenge because if we look back to the housing crisis of 2007, it was a long time before property values came back, but they did come back. But this is a different type of dynamic where property values are probably physically not able to come back. And so this is equity that's lost forever. It was extremely difficult to estimate all this nationally. I don't know, I'm not sure I have enough zeros to do it. But there's a real struggle and a real challenge of figuring out for the most severely impacted properties that are not savable, what will be the appropriate policy.
No, I appreciate that. I see my time is up, but I think one of the purposes of this and other hearings is just to underscore the costs of inaction and doing nothing, which is why it was so important that we got started with things like the Inflation Reduction Act, but much more work ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have some time for another round. If any senator wishes to stay for another round, I'd like to ask a few questions. First, since it's been mentioned in this hearing that some of us actually support carbon pricing legislation, I'll take it just as a point of personal privilege that I'm one of those. In fact, I'm the author of a carbon pricing bill, and essentially nothing of what Dr. Lewis said about carbon pricing is true as regards my bill. So you don't have to follow whatever his path is if you're actually looking at my legislation. And I want to make sure that's clear in the record of this hearing. Dr. Lewis, I also want to make clear your doctorate is in government, right? Not in science?
Correct.
Are you familiar with scientific research related to climate tipping points?
Yes.
Do you understand that, particularly as regards sea level rise, reaching certain climate tipping points can dramatically increase the risk and the rate of sea level rise?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
And that is, I don't see that reflected anywhere in your testimony. Your testimony makes no reference to hitting tipping points. Is that correct?
No, it does not.
Okay.
If you recall the fifth assessment report, I was going to explain why I didn't think it was particularly pertinent.
If you keep it brief, go ahead, but you're into my time and I have limited time, so go
All right, in the fifth assessment report, the IPCC said it was exceedingly likely that we would see any kind of ice sheet crack up in the 21st century. So we were dealing with issues in the next couple of decades, I thought, and I didn't see that it was entirely relevant. I did talk about tail risk at some point.
I'm going to reclaim my time here so I can talk to Ms. Michaud, who's my Rhode Island friend here. Warren, if you could just speak a little bit into a little bit more detail, because I know a lot of people are listening to this who live in coastal towns and have the experience that you're dealing with. You're dealing with very specific and practical things. You're dealing with Warren's waterfront economy, which for anybody in Rhode Island is a really wonderful waterfront economy with terrific restaurants and access points. You're dealing with flooded roads and infrastructure. You're dealing with emergency evacuation issues in other towns where the road that would get you out of Warren in emergency are themselves likely to be compromised by that emergency. And your biggest thing has probably been the water treatment plant, which, because of gravity, in a lot of places along the coast, is located down low right at the coast. Give us a picture of how that all fits together for you. And those will be our closing words.
Sure. So thank you for the question. we are dealing with a lot of those issues, especially the wastewater management system is a grave concern. As you mentioned, due to gravity, it is located on the coast in the lowest point of the town, which is the case in many towns or most towns. And the situation that we're encountering is that we've just done this major upgrade, which has been very costly, but it is only resilient to 3 feet of sea level rise. And unfortunately, when we look at the projections long-term, looking at 2100 or even beyond then, once we get past that 3 feet of sea level rise, there really is no saving the facility. You can't build an island in the middle of the ocean. So we are looking at some major changes in the future to what our community looks like, not only moving that facility, but also potentially buying out properties and moving the people away from harm, which is going to be a significant change for the town. I think the great thing about living in a town like Warren is the sense of community, and I would say that there's definitely a difference between surviving and living, and people want to live. And they want to live in a community where they can enjoy their neighborhood, they can enjoy their neighborhood businesses and their schools and their houses of worship. And climate change is really a threat to that. It's a threat to the sense of community that has existed in Warren for centuries. And we really want to see if there's anything that we can do to preserve that sense of community going forward while preparing for the eventuality of climate change.
Well, those are about as good a conclusion as I could hope for, so I'll end the hearing there. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing. The full written statements of the witnesses will be included in the record. For the senators who wish to file questions for the record, they're due by noon tomorrow, with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk in Dirksen 624. Email copies will also be accepted, and we ask the witnesses to respond to any questions for the record within 7 days of receipt. Without further business before the committee, the hearing stands adjourned. Thank you.